Hi, I'm Allie Jackson Jolly with Forbes News. I'm here with Mark Sedlander. He is a federal criminal defense and white collar attorney. Mark, welcome and thanks for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
So, wanted to have you here to help us break down what's happening right now with President Biden's embattled son, Hunter Biden. We know he is facing charges, federal felony gun charges, for allegedly lying to a licensed gun dealer. What should we know about these charges and what should we be looking for?
Well, the charges break down basically into two buckets. The first two, there are three charges in the indictment. And just to start off, this is an indictment that was brought by the United States Department of Justice. So he is in federal court in Wilmington, Delaware. It's not brought by a state or local prosecutor. So there's an indictment that has three charges in it. The first two charges are in one bucket, and that's that Mr. Biden allegedly knowingly made a false statement on a federal firearms form. Whenever someone engages in a firearms purchase, they're required to fill out a form, and that form goes in the person's record, and it goes to the firearms dealer. In that form, there are 14 or 15 questions in a row that require the purchaser to check either yes or no. And one of those questions asks whether the purchaser is a user or addicted to controlled substances. And the allegation, my understanding, is that Mr. Biden indicated that he was neither of those things and checked the box for no. And that underlies basically the first bucket of charges. The third charge in the indictment, and what I'll describe as the second bucket, is alleges that Mr. Biden possessed the firearm knowing that he was using and addicted to controlled substances.
Yeah, so when you lay all this out for us like this, let us know, like, what are the punishments? Like, what sentences may he face? How serious is this really?
Well, any time that a person is indicted in federal court in this country, it's very serious. The sentences in federal court tend to be harsh compared to many states. And my understanding is that if Mr. Biden is convicted of all three counts, he could face a maximum of 25 years in federal prison. Now, I want to follow that quickly by saying, first of all, he's presumed innocent. The prosecution has a very high burden of proving his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt with respect to each charge. But if he were to be convicted, it is highly unlikely. In fact, there would be, I would say, almost no chance that he would spend anywhere near that time in federal prison or be sentenced to anything close to that. Even if he were sentenced to any period of incarceration, which I think is unlikely, even if he were to be convicted on all three counts. Federal judges tend to sentence what's called consecutively. So let's say someone is charged with three charges, like Mr. Biden is, in connection with one common scheme. Judges tend to sentence those sentences concurrently, and they'll run them together. So even if he could, in theory and legally, be sentenced up to 25 years, 10 on a couple of those counts and 5 years on the third count, the judges tend to run those together. We could talk later about whether or not I think a judge would sentence Mr. Biden to any period of incarceration, considering his background, that my understanding is even if he were convicted, he'd be a first-time offender, and the nonviolent nature of the charges, and the honestly relatively minor nature of the charges, and add that on to what appears to have been some genuine post-offense rehabilitation on Mr. Biden's part. If he were to be convicted, I think a sentence of incarceration would be
Okay, but
very
before
unlikely.
we delve it all the way into that, let me ask you, you talked a bit about the burden of proof. I want to understand, like, are these charges irrefutable? When you're looking at the case and the evidence, how tight to you is the evidence? And so do you think that, like, I guess I'm asking, do you believe that he's going to be charged with something?
Do I believe that he'd be convicted of something?
Hmm.
Well, that's one of the exciting parts of a jury trial is it's up to 12 average citizens. And a case like this, I mean, it could really go either way. So the prosecution would likely argue that just use your common sense, ladies and gentlemen. The prosecution, I believe, has and will continue to present evidence that Mr. Biden was using controlled substances. Obviously, he was aware, they will argue, that he was using controlled substances. And when he checked the box that he was not using controlled substances or not a user of controlled substances, they will argue he knowingly made a false statement. On the other hand, my understanding is that the defense is raising perhaps that Mr. Biden did not consider himself an addict, let's say, at the time, because one of the questions is, are you using controlled substances or an addict? And perhaps Mr. Biden did not consider himself an addict. And what time period are they talking about? Did he use that day? Did he use in that year or that month? So there is some wiggle room when it comes to whether or not a person knowingly made a false statement. Maybe he didn't consider himself a user at the time. The judge will instruct the jury at the end how they're supposed to apply the facts to the law. But there is definitely some areas where the defense, I think, can make some legitimate arguments. We could talk, I think, also about the fact that I think for the most part, jurors tend to sympathize with people who have substance abuse issues. This case, whether or not the prosecution can establish that he was an addict, I think it's clear that there was some drug use going on. And sometimes, whether it's one or all the jurors, they may sympathize with someone in a position like Mr. Biden. My understanding is that during jury selection, prospective juror after prospective juror indicated that they had in some way been affected, either them or a family member or friend, by substance abuse and addiction.
Yeah, and obviously, I'm going to kick the elephant in the room, which is the politics around all of this. Here we are in a federal election year. It's impossible not to understand that the reason this case is so sizzly, has got so many eyeballs on it, is because of the politics and the situation that we're in right now. Of course, some on one side will say that this is a politically motivated trial. It's the reason that Hunter Biden is on trial. The others will talk about the fact that First Lady Dr. Jill Biden sat very supportively and solemnly in that court and perhaps made it impossible to be unbiased around for a jury to be unbiased. But talk to me as a defense attorney. Like, what do you make of all of this? Do you think that there's politics are so tightly wound into this that it's almost impossible to think about it as if Hunter Biden were just a regular American citizen facing these charges?
Well, I think that's a great question. I mean, my understanding is that the Biden family has a long history in the Wilmington, Delaware area where the trial is unfolding. So almost certainly every prospective juror and probably every seated juror has been familiar with the Biden family for most of their lives, if not their whole lives. So of course that will come into play, and every juror will have to consider that when making his or her decision. But the defense and prosecution both have opportunities to vet the jurors during the jury selection process, to ask the court to strike jurors either for cause or because they just want to strike particular jurors within certain rules. So both sides have an opportunity to engage in the jury selection process. And when a jury is seated, the defense and prosecution both theoretically are satisfied that that's a jury that can conduct a fair trial.